I think we have to be very careful about how we develop and how we interact with, how we regulate AI for exactly this reason. Um, there's this ongoing debate in my field and in philosophy about whether AI will become conscious, whether it will be not only smart, but also start to feel something as well. Currently, GPT-4 might say, you know, I feel sad or something like that.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. We are kicking off 2024. Does it make any sense talking about time? Timelines and months and figures and resolutions? Fuck it. Anyway, as I told you at the end of the year, last year, taking a break, and I did take a break, strangely fell ill during the break. Hey, when I was doing stuff, I wasn't falling ill. What does that go to show? But had a good month off, and I'm so excited to be back for you on this podcast. And again, I appreciate all of you who've been a part of the journey for the past 2 years, and before that on the Baby Bat podcast. If you forgot, I was doing that on my own, single-handedly, putting up stuff, talking about my opinions, talking about life. But I'm excited for the conversations coming up on this podcast, for you to listen to it. There's so much going on. There's so much happened in the past month, right? It's just, again, the noise is amplified. Israel, Palestine, universities, Donald Trump, the friends that we thought we are not going to hear back from. They're coming back. Anyhow, what I'm going to do going forward is that I'm just going to bring the guest up because they have so much to say and I don't want to take away from it. I will, however, share my opinions, my thoughts, my rants, my ponderings on other episodes, which I will put up individually away from the conversation so you can separately focus on these things that I am doing. As always, yes, if you do like what you listen to, do share it with a friend. If you're watching this on YouTube, do subscribe to the channel. It does help. To like the video, man, and do share it with like-minded people or unlike-minded people. If you're listening to this, of course, please do rate it if the platform that you're listening to it on does provide the opportunity to rate the podcast, because it does help. And help is what I need. As the Beatles said, help. I don't know the rest of the lyrics, but you get the hint. Let me talk about today's guest. We're talking about consciousness. We're talking about the state of being. What does it mean to be human? What is the experience? What are we feeling? What are we understanding? What are we going through in this life we call, with the body and the mind and the brain and everything that it embodies? What is it understand? And consciousness is such a big thing. What does it mean to be a conscious person, a conscious being, a conscious entity, a being that's aware? So what is that? Is that the same? Feeling, awareness, consciousness, intelligence. And to talk about that, I've got Anil Seth, who is a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex. He's a proponent of materialist experiences of consciousness. And today he's to join me to talk about everything I said previously. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Anil Seth. I hope you enjoyed as much as I do and did and do. Who knows? It's the past, the present, and the future. All right. Anil Seth, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a pleasure having you here today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Lovely. So, consciousness. Now, okay, firstly, when I read just the brief line of the professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex, I think that first statement must have made a lot of Indian aunties go weak in the knees. Just such a glorified title. I love it. So, yeah, it's quite a lot that goes into that title alone. But let me just initially ask you, because there is a huge emphasis today when we look at the brain and we look at the human potential. There's this attachment to achievement, intelligence, and consciousness is also very loosely woven into these concepts. So maybe to start with, could you explain to me and people listening, what's the fundamental difference between intelligence and consciousness?
I think it's a really deep difference. And it's a good place to start, actually, because especially with the rise of artificial intelligence, which I'm sure we'll probably get onto later, these questions are very much in the air. We like to think as human beings that we are species smart. We think in general that we're intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
And intelligence, you'll find any number of definitions, but very broadly, intelligence is about doing the right thing at the right time, whether it's playing chess well or being able to make your dinner, or just being able to move around your house without bumping into things.
Mm-hmm.
These are all aspects of intelligence. And consciousness, on the other hand, is about experience. It's about raw feeling. It's what makes us, I think, more than just complex objects capable of doing complicated things. Now, being intelligent gives us different ways of being conscious. Like I can have different kinds of conscious experiences when I think about particular things, or project myself into the future in various ways. But fundamentally, I think they're pretty different. So basic conscious experiences, like for instance, the feeling of joy or the feeling of pain, um, don't seem to require all that much intelligence at all, and probably shared by many other species besides human beings. So I think we make a mistake sometimes when we couple these two things closely together. I
Mm.
actually think there's what you said at the beginning there. Sometimes this association is made because people have different definitions of consciousness as well. There's
Mm-hmm.
this kind of higher level view of consciousness, like being aware of what's going on in our world, being aware of what's going on in politics, being aware of what's going on with the climate, with our environment. That's sometimes wrapped into this idea of consciousness. But that's and that may well require like being smart in particular ways. But that's a very different understanding of the term consciousness. As neuroscientists use it, and most philosophers, it's the raw fact of being the subject of experience.
Okay, because we have this tendency as human beings to kind of glorify certain concepts that make us look good, right? We say we're the most intelligent species. As a result, we have this domination over other species on this planet. So, could we say that intelligence is something we can attribute specifically to human beings, but consciousness is something that transcends all species?
I think we can probably attribute consciousness and intelligence more broadly than just human beings,
Okay.
but in different ways and to different things. So there are different ways of being conscious. Human consciousness is just one small region in the vast space of possible minds, possible ways of being conscious.
Mm.
A bat was going to have different conscious experiences to a human. Bats have echolocation. What's it like to be a bat? There's a famous philosophy paper with exactly that title, and making the case that only a bat can know that, but there would be something it is like to be a bat. It's going to experience the world in its own unique way. And maybe not everything that is alive is conscious. I mean, it's very hard for me to be confident about whether an ant has any kind of conscious experience. Now, I
Mm.
think consciousness, like everything else in biology, evolved,
Yeah.
and it, it's useful for us in particular ways. So it just may not be there for very simple creatures. And intelligence, on the other hand, that also expresses itself in different ways in different species. We humans, you're right, we have this kind of human exceptionalist tendency. We tend to put ourselves at the top of every pyramid, at the center of the universe. There's this historical, certainly in the West, this really historical um, temptation to try and make ourselves distinct from the rest of the natural world, closer to God than to the rest of the animal kingdom. And so we have tended to emphasize a particular kind of intelligence, the sort of rational thinking um, that is can be separated out from our messy biological realities. But then other animals are intelligent in very different ways. Bees that are able to forage for food and communicate the location of honey. Creatures like bees are
Hmm.
intelligent in very different ways. They can navigate to honey in their environment, find out where it is, find their way back, communicate the location through dancing to other members, other bees in the hive. And even machines can be intelligent in particular ways. That's a really big open question about whether computers can have the same kind of general flexible intelligence that we human beings seem to have.
Mm.
But they're clearly smart in narrow ways already. I mean, they can already beat humans at chess. They can develop new drugs. They can solve mathematical problems. They can do all kinds of things. So, yeah, both intelligence and consciousness go way beyond the human. but I think they go in somewhat different directions.
Yeah, because, if I try to understand it from the hemispheres of the brain, again, this comes from my limited knowledge of reading on the topic, is we kind of have these vaguely four hemispheres, right? And we say right brain way of thinking, left brain way of thinking, some is
Hmm.
more logical, some is more rational, some is more emotional. And when you mention feelings, the raw feeling of existence or the raw feeling that courses through our senses as we experience the world around us. From the brain, it's purely a chemical release that results in these feelings. So, when we talk about the mind, and we talk about the mind being a construct from certain experiences the brain has witnessed in the body, right? Whether it's the body of a human being or a dog. So, where does this come from? Because is this consciousness now, when I look at it, is it my consciousness that is limited to the realm of my body, which I perceive through my sight and my hearing and my sense of touch and smell? Or is it a consciousness that is passed on from, say, my mother to me and from her mother to her? And is it specific to a family? Is it specific to a certain group? Is it a shared consciousness? Is it a set of experiences that is passed on or inherited or is conditioned by people around you?
And there's a lot of open questions there, and I don't think there are good answers to many of them, but let's try.
Hmm.
So the first thing to say is when we talk about feeling, what I just want to say what I mean by the word, which is not necessarily what everybody means, but I mean not just emotional feelings like the feeling of joy or of anguish or something like that,
Hmm.
but even visual experiences. It feels like something to have a visual experience. When you open your eyes in the morning and you look around you, it feels like something to experience the blue sky or the boring wallpaper, depending on what you're looking at. And
Hmm.
there's a feeling of a certain kind to every conscious experience we have. That for me is the essence of consciousness, that it's not just a complicated object whirring away in subjective oblivion. There is experience happening. And the next thing that you said is that it's isn't this just chemicals doing their thing in the brain? Well, that's the big question. I mean, that's the question that as a neuroscientist, we're trying to understand. And how is it possible that this incredibly complicated biological machine, the brain,
Hmm.
how could it generate or be identical to, or just even how is it related to conscious experiences? Because a conscious experience, let's say like the feeling of looking at a blue sky, I mean, that experience just doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that an object could have or generate. I mean, this is the big dilemma that goes way back in philosophy, both in Eastern philosophy and in Western philosophy.
Hmm.
This relationship between the mind, the mental world, the world of experience, and the physical world, the world of matter. Of course, Western philosophy puts it in a particular way, puts it particularly sharply.
Hmm.
Descartes probably did the most damage this way. But there still is a question here. How should we think of the relationship between any kind of conscious experience and any kind of stuff, whether that stuff is a brain um, or something else? Now we know that there's an intimate relationship between the brain and consciousness. And we know this for many, many reasons. I mean, this is really the starting point. This is why I chose to be a neuroscientist to address this problem.
Right.
You have general anesthesia, consciousness goes away entirely. And it's
Yeah.
a fantastic invention. Glad that it does. And it comes back, even more importantly.
Yeah.
And if you have brain damage of a certain kind, then your conscious experience changes in a particular way. If you intervene in the brain, you change consciousness. So we know there's this very, very intimate relationship. And that nature of that relationship may well be shaped by society, may well be shaped by family. If we just take as a starting point that the way experience happens for an individual, the experience of the world, but also how they experience being themselves, if we take as a starting point that that depends on the brain in a very, very intimate, tightly coupled way, then anything that affects the brain is likely to affect our conscious experience too. And of
Mm.
course, that can include, the genes that we inherit from our parents. That can include the influences that that we undergo when we're growing up in development. That can also include the assumptions that society builds into how we perceive things. But that's still all compatible with the idea that your consciousness is in the here and now. It's yours, and it's dependent only on what's going on in your brain. I think that's the key premise of the neuroscientific approach. It might be wrong. It
Mhm.
might be that consciousness is sort of this fundamental property of the universe, and we're tapping into it somehow. Um, Nobody really knows. But the view that, at least in practice, that I work with is that no, what you're conscious of is just dependent on what's happening in your brain right now. But what's happening in your brain right now then itself depends on many things besides your brain and your own body. It depends on society, history, culture, many things.
In some way, that's extremely empowering, right? That you are the um, hero or the conductor of your consciousness through your senses. But um, you know,
But
I
hold on a
think,
minute.
yeah.
I would just want, I try and resist this a bit as well, because this idea that there's an essence of you that is conducting your experiences and maybe then choosing what to do, exercising free will of some sorts,
Mm,
that I think gets us into trouble, because it
okay.
gets us back to this idea that you are separate from your experiences, you are separate from what your brain is doing. And so then you have the question, but what is this you? What does this consist in?
Yeah.
How does it relate to the brain? This was always the problem that Rene Descartes got into in the 1780s and century, and philosophers ever since. But a different way to think about it, and I think a way that's actually really compatible with more Eastern ways of thinking, Indian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy as well, is that the self is not this little mini me that's orchestrating things. It's part of experience too. It's always changing. The brain generates the experience of being you through the same principles that it generates the experience of looking at a blue sky. I still think this is very empowering, but in different ways, because it releases us from some of the obligations that we might feel ourselves to be under if we feel that we should control everything like a little pilot inside our skulls. Um, but it also gives us I think, the recognition that our conscious experiences, our ways of being in the world can change, and we can cultivate new ways of experiencing the self and the world. And that can be a very empowering recognition indeed.
Because in psychology, I read there are a couple of concepts, right? The working self and the true self. And the working self is something that is shaped by perception and life experiences and how we go about what we do and things we do and things we say. But the true self is beyond that, and it's something that just observes. Again, these concepts may be, I mean, I may be misnaming them, I might be not doing justice to its definition. But I think in a piece you'd written, which I read last year, you spoke about how when, say, you watch a sunset and say, I watch a sunset and add on the layer of the fact that I'm visually impaired, we both have very different experiences. So,
Mhm.
how does that pan out? Is it again the brain using the sense of smell, sight, sound, and touch and whatnot will go to a beach, and when I think of a beach, now I don't know if we're getting into semantics, but when I imagine a beach or I experience a beach, it may be extremely different for you. So now, is that going into the space of memories? Is that my consciousness using this vessel of my body, being all of it, the brain, the eyes, the nose, all the organs, making sense of an environment that it has created an imprint of?
I think it's probably simpler than that. I mean, I think the simplest way to understand it is that just as we all have different bodies, we're different heights, different skin colors, different body shapes, and so on. we all have different brains too,
Hmm.
but those differences aren't immediately visible. We can see from the outside how we differ externally, even if those differences aren't very big. We can just see them. But when it comes to differences between our brains and how those differences manifest in different experiences, like we go to the beach together, we both have a look, and we're going to be having different experiences. Now, some of these might be related to memory. I might have been to this beach before and have some memories about it, and so that will trigger some emotions and so on. And you might not, and so of course you're going to have a different experience. That aspect will be traceable to things like memory. Maybe I go surfing, and so I've got some sort of embodied memory of it as well, and maybe you don't. So there are certain things like that. But I think even more basically, we just look at the waves and we have a different visual experience. And this may be because we've got different visual abilities. I mean, you said you're visually impaired. Maybe you'll tell me in what way. But even if we were both completely normally sighted, our brains, the visual parts of our brains, might be different too, and we'll have a different visual experience. The challenge is we won't know that because only I have my conscious experience, and it seems as though I just see the world as it really is. It just seems as though, okay, I see the waves to be that color because they are that color.
Mm.
That's how experience presents a world to us. It doesn't present it as being this kind of conspiracy between our brains and the world. It just seems to us that we transparently register things as they really are. But the novelist Anais Nin put it very beautifully when she said, "We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are, and we are all different." So really, it's back to this basic principle from which neuroscience starts, that all of our experiences depend on the brain and only on the state of the brain. And if our brains are in different states or we have different brains, then even for the same shared objective reality, we will have different experiences. And I think recognizing that again is quite empowering because it can cultivate a bit of humility about the way we see. We use it very metaphorically sometimes that it's quite hard to see things from another person's perspective. And if we really understand that this is true literally, that two people can have a different experience for the same thing, then I think it helps us at least allow space for the idea that other people not only see things differently, but might feel things differently and even believe things differently. And this is a bit idealistic, but I like to think that this idea has some potential. When you cash it out with experiments and evidence and through people's lived experience, that this has some potential to diffuse some of these echo chamber dynamics that are really problematic now, where we just always want evidence to confirm our pre-existing beliefs, and we just
Yeah.
believe that they're right. And how could anybody ever think differently?
And everyone thinks their version of the truth is the only truth out there, right?
Right, but do you remember that photo of the dress from about 10 years ago? There was this there was this image, a photograph of a dress that half the world saw as blue and black and half the world saw as white and gold.
Mm.
And I thought this was fantastic because you know it really just surfaced this phenomenon that those people who saw it one way, they were so convinced that they could not accept that somebody else would see it so differently. And I think that in a little microcosm, that's exactly the phenomenon that is so problematic today, where people are so convinced they're right that they're unable to listen to a different perspective.
And I want to talk about that with relation to artificial intelligence, and we talk about deep fakes and how AI is generating so many things which are, again, controversial. People are going into camps based on what they believe is true, and it's affecting society, politics, economies as well. I want to come back to that, but before that, if you don't mind, I want to just uh, you asked me about the vision part, right? The reason I mentioned the visual impairment is because when I went up a few weeks back and I was thinking of the idea of a swimming pool because there's a pool next to me, and it wasn't I could physically see the water, but it was this memory I had when I lost my central vision when I was 8, and the peripheral has dropped. It's got Stargardt disease. I'm sure you've heard of it, like macular degeneration. So the peripheral has dropped over the past 33 years. And now it's probably 3% of what it was. So every time I go, it's relying on some combination of old memory. So that's why I found that fascinating, because I don't see sunsets anymore. Or I might see a glow, I might see a haze. I don't see the ocean. I might see it close up, just the froth of the foam on the water. I don't see what a pool deck looks like. I'm just giving you examples of things which are in reality now, but there is a creation that exists already in my head, which I'm referring to,
Yes.
which is very
Yeah,
interesting.
it is. And I think, I mean, that's a beautiful description of how the world seems to you. So you know, when you buy a pool and you have your eyes open, you still have a kind of visual experience, right? Is that true to say?
I think it's not so visual anymore. That's the strange part, because I um, try to make it visual, because it's kind of this thing holding on to a little bit of what sight you have left. But
Right.
more and more, if I start saying, okay, you know what, let's not rely on that, but close your eyes maybe, or just take a deep breath and smell the water, maybe the chlorine in the water, or maybe the lapping of the water by the walls of the pool. It's in somehow reinforcing different, not reinforcing, sorry, but creating a new representation in my mind or in my
Mhm.
experience. So it's not really a sight of the pool, but it's new experience of what it means to be by a water body.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I think it highlights again that, and I'm guilty of this too. I mean, I've used most of my examples have been about vision when I've been trying to talk about the nature of conscious experience.
Hmm.
And this is a bit of a prejudice that we have in neuroscience and philosophy, certainly. Talk about vision a lot. But of course, other senses that exist, as you are much more aware of than me. But we all have them.
Hmm.
And any kind of experience, when I go to the beach and I look at it too, it's not just a visual experience. I am smelling it. There's the tactile element of sand beneath my feet. There's the temperature that I feel, the sense of a breeze against my skin. All of these things contribute to the experience of being standing on a beach. And they interact with each other too. So the senses that we have don't operate in isolation. Sight is affected by sound, is affected by touch in ways that we still don't fully understand. I have people in my group working on this about exactly how the brain puts different senses together. And in your case, there's a lot of compensation going on, right? As your vision has become less reliable, other senses step up and perhaps become more vivid in your conscious experience. As you said, you might smell the chlorine by the pool. In my case, if I go there, my brain might sense this chlorine, but it may not be something I'm aware of. I may not be able to name that. So I do think that's fascinating. I think the other thing it brings up is that perception, when we experience the world around us, it is not a process of just reading out the information that comes into the senses. Even though it might seem like that, it might seem like that when our experience is just this way in which information enters our brains and the brain reads it out, like what's there.
Yeah.
But one of the lessons from neuroscience, and a central theme in my own work over the years, has been that any kind of experience is as much, if not more, an active generative process, not a passive registration. The brain, in my view anyway, this is still a theory. It's not, it's certainly not, it's probably wrong in some ways, but the brain is continuously making predictions about what's out there in the world, and the sensory data, whether it's visual or olfactory, smell, or whatever it might be, is primarily there to calibrate the brain's predictions to keep them tied to the world. And what we experience, the core claim I have, what we experience are the predictions themselves. So another way to think about it is your brain, yeah, you do have a kind of model of what a swimming pool is like. The brain has its own idea of what a swimming pool is like. And that depends on your past experiences, when you had more vision, so you have these visual memories. And it depends on what happens when you buy a swimming pool now. And it depends on, what what society thinks a swimming pool is too. I mean, all of these factors will shape this model that the brain has. And that will underlie the experience that you have of it. So I think this sort of makes all the connections. Memory is part of it, but only part of it. Everything, lots of other things contribute to the brain's predictions about things. And that, for me, that's what we actually experience.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, because I never acknowledge the importance of the other senses. And I think it's a society we live in where the emphasis is on the visual input. And it's strange, like, does the brain have a preference saying, okay, I'll first resort to my sight and use that data, and then if that's compromised, then go to the hearing part, then the smell? Because, and especially now we're bombarded with a visual overload, right? With every
Yeah.
platform, with every device, it's kind of like first see, and then after a little bit of a delay, listen or hear or sense, right? And now with the advancements in VR and AR, it'll be interesting to see what happens to our perception and our sense of reality. But just to add another point into this conversation is when I was talking to someone recently about the Vedanta approach to consciousness, and this again is in its most simplified form, it looks at how we are a part of a collective consciousness. And if you want to give the analogy of the ocean, consciousness is the ocean, and all of us are little waves that are representations and extensions of that consciousness. And the consciousness, be it the fish in the water, be it the tree on the ground, or be it you or me, are experiencing this moment, or the world around us, or the planet, or whatever it may be, and it's all going back into the shared collective consciousness, which is continuous and impermanent in some way, and transcends this planet and goes beyond all of it. And if we add that element into what we're talking about, does it go along the lines of what you are studying and what you're a proponent of, or is it against that in some way?
I think it's rather independent of it. Typically there's a distinction that's quite useful between the metaphysics of consciousness, which is a complicated philosophical term, but it's about what we think consciousness really is and its relationship to the rest of the universe. Is it something that, as you were saying, in this perspective from Vedanta, that is always there, perhaps ever present, that transcends the body, perhaps transcends the planet, or is it a phenomenon that is just a biological phenomenon, a little bit like digestion,
Yeah.
that evolution has hit upon for human beings, but that isn't everywhere and wasn't always. And I find this quite a weird perspective that, it could have been for the vast majority of the existence of the universe, there was just no consciousness at all. There were things happening, but none of it was experienced. It
Yeah.
was just a subjectively empty universe. I mean, this is really hard to get one's head around. So there's actually a temptation to find a way to think different things, to avoid trying to get your head around that kind of bleak prospect. It could be that conscious experiences arose only once and only here. Now, is this a scary prospect? In a way it is, but I think actually it can be interpreted as making us realize what we've got and take care of ourselves and our planet a little bit better. Just this idea that consciousness can't be taken for granted.
Yeah.
But back to your point, I think it's nothing that we can do in neuroscience is going to prove or disprove these perspectives about the ultimate nature of consciousness. There's another view which is quite similar called panpsychism, that consciousness is everywhere and is as fundamental as mass or energy or electrical charge or something like that.
Right.
Now, science, as it is now, can't really distinguish these different alternatives. What, for me, the way I tend to think about this is, what is the perspective that leads me to, what's the most productive perspective that's most likely to change my understanding of the phenomenon? And if I think of consciousness as something that's intimately tied to the brain, then I'll do different things. I'll do different kinds of experiments. I'll think about different kinds of theories that in practice have already changed our understanding of consciousness and neuroscience from this perspective already has. But that doesn't mean that it's ultimately the right thing. And some of the insights from Vedanta, from Buddhism as well, about, for instance, the nature of the self and impermanence,
Mm-hmm.
are really important clues. But I think rather than being clues about the ultimate nature of reality, they're warnings about some of the assumptions that we have that might constrain our thinking in ways that we don't even realize. Like this idea that the self is this little mini me inside my head that's doing
Yeah.
all the rational thinking. Now, that's an assumption that's challenged effectively in Eastern philosophy
Yeah.
in ways that are now really very, very compatible with modern neuroscience. So I think there's just an interesting synergy, but they don't clash head on in any particular way. I think the key is to try and find the synergies. Of course, when some religious texts or spiritual texts make specific, very specific claims, like for instance, that if a conscious self might survive the death of the body and then persist and be reborn in a different body, it's very hard to reconcile that with what we know from neuroscience and modern science. But if you weaken that claim and just say something, there's something that persists, something that goes on, well, maybe there's a space for that still.
Mm. Now, I'd like to hope that both can be, um, along the journey of discovery and in science proof, that it is a means to the same end, which is understanding how we experience consciousness, right? Because if you take away if you believe in the idea of non-duality, will that make for a more hopeful future where we're not trying to identify each other as different intelligent beings or groups of different intelligent beings who have different and different interpretations of the experience in the world and what is right and what is wrong and which is a better way or not a better way? It seems with now the environment we have with as you pointed out earlier, where there are a lot of opportunities to be in echo chambers for whatever reason and in whatever group and idea that attracts you. Oh, do we and there's something I wanted to go back to, which is the idea of intelligence, and now the artificial form of that intelligence. Do we have any proof that the more heightened levels of intelligence impairs your consciousness, or the other way around, a being that is less intelligent has a more uninhibited experience that enhances consciousness?
This is a very good question. I think that there's a case you might make that creatures that have less cognitive sophistication, less intelligence than us, um, may live more in the present,
Mm,
and so may have a more vivid way of consciously being in the world.
mm,
And we all know this intuitively. If we daydream or we get distracted or we spend our day worrying about the future or ruminating about the past, we're just less present in our worlds consciously. We're less aware of what's going on around us. And of course, the practice of meditation is quite useful in trying to help us address this problem, be in the world, pay attention to our immediate sensations a little bit more closely. So yeah, I think you can make that case that intelligence can sometimes take us outside of our immediate present, but it gives us different ways of being conscious too. I
yeah.
can imagine the future in ways that creatures without the ability to mentally time travel cannot. I
Mm,
can think about the past and use those memories to decide to do different things in the future. It can be more flexible that way. So you gain something, you give something up in this relationship between intelligence and consciousness. But also, just one of the other things you said, it's made me think about, you know, are there views that give us more hope for the future? I think this is super interesting, and it's kind of a question that goes even another level deeper, another level higher than what we've been talking about. Like,
mhm,
are there morally or ethically better ways to think about consciousness than
yeah.
others?
Right.
And I suppose as a scientist, my assumption is that trying to get closer to the way things actually are um, will be the most hopeful, will be the most useful and beneficial for society. But that in itself is an assumption that, many philosophers have questioned. But is that really true? Is it always better to know things more accurately um, for for our personal fulfillment and for the betterment of society? I think it's true, but I don't think we can necessarily assume that that's true. What gives me a bit of confidence is the way things are beginning to line up and converge. As we were saying, these synergies between ways of thinking that religious and spiritual traditions have cultivated, and of course they've been shaped by many factors. They've been shaped partly because they help us as a society and as individuals. Of course, they've been shaped by other influences too, dynamics of power, dynamics of social hierarchies, and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But some of the essential, perhaps the more persistent lessons turn out to be very, very complementary to what neuroscience is telling us now as well about the impermanence of the self, the the relationship between appearance and reality. There's a lovely concept from Vedanta again about Maya, that the
Illusion.
idea that
Right.
well, it's usually said illusion. I think in my limited understanding of this, there was another description I read which really resonated with me, which is that Maya is that which gives our experience the false impression of being real.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's something I'm really interested in from a neuroscience perspective as well, because I think that's the source of a lot of our confusions. We just the nature of experience is that it seems to reveal reality as it is.
But that
And
reality in itself is a creation, a false creation in some way.
well, the reality of our experience is always indirect. It's not false. Evolution has been very, very careful. Well, evolution isn't careful, but the dynamics of evolution have made sure that the way we experience the world is very, very closely related to what's really out there. I mean, that's why we survive and don't
Yeah, you
die.
can't say like, "Am I seeing a tiger?" It's not really a tiger. Next thing you're eaten up. Yeah,
Yeah,
unless
but
people
the
say, "Are
tiger
you?"
that you're seeing, is not the thing that's actually there. What's there? Who knows? Ask a physicist. But the color of the tiger does not exist independently of your brain. Yes, there's something there, and our brains make sure that we experience it in a way that helps us survive.
Yeah,
So yeah, there's this beautiful indirectness that that the brain mediates between our experience and reality.
the way we are going forward, I think it'll be like social media just fighting about what is a tiger, and just different groups hashtagging each other.
Yeah, or they'll say like there's no tiger. It's a
Yeah,
it's a fake news. Tiger is fake news,
yeah,
and
you
that's the
offended me.
problem because there is a fact of the matter. You can say there is a tiger or there isn't, and that really matters. So this is why the dynamics of social media is getting so pernicious when it becomes reality denying.
Yeah, someone would say, with all this noise we are experiencing and the tumultuous kind of back and forth way going on about something as simple as does a tiger exist or not? Is a tiger real or not? What is a tiger? Define a tiger. But someone would say, I would escape to the caves, adopt the practice of meditation, various forms of breathing, and go into myself and be a part of the larger consciousness, which is the idea of impermanence. And it 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 completely takes me away from this human experience, but it takes me to a deeper realm of understanding, right? The other side would be, I have this vessel as a human being, which is the brain and all its organs, and it has these mind-boggling, if you want to call it, or just this amazing potential to absorb the environment, to understand, to perceive, to create these experiences. And both are beautiful in their own way. But with the things we have today, as a neuroscientist who's in the real world, who's practically conducting experiments to understand, is there, I wouldn't say a solution, that would be not a fair question, but what is the direction in which a person, because you hear a lot of these people telling people, get meditate, be mindful. The only way to get away from depression and anxiety, or to away from suffering, is to escape from it and understand. And I see the beauty in breathing, in meditation, spending time with your thoughts and understanding your where you are at that point and how you face the world before being bombarded by other people's perceptions and ideas and all those things. But it isn't. Sometimes if you go and you try to meditate, it doesn't work, your suffering increases.
Mm.
There needs to be some kind of sense a person can make, saying, this is my brain, these are the chemicals. Yes, I can go to a therapist, I can get a psychiatrist to prescribe medicines. There are now psychedelics which are helping people with depression. And I don't mean to go down the mental health or mental illness part, but clearly there is a relation between the way a person who's mentally ill, who's got severe anxiety or depression, the way they experience the world, and maybe the way their consciousness exists, and someone who is in a much more mentally fit state. And how can you, through your work, maybe understand that or shed light on it?
It's difficult, and I think you're absolutely right that there's a bit of a double-edged blade to everything. There's no panacea, there's no magic bullet, whether it be at neuroscience or meditation or psychedelics. I don't think there's anything that is sort of a universal solution to the challenges that we face in terms of in the quality of our mental lives.
Hmm.
Um, and meditation is particularly interesting here because yes, there's a whole industry, a huge industry now in meditation, right? In
Yeah.
meditative practice. But it can be very aversive to people as well. You're right that when you can end up struggling and feeling much worse. Also, you might feel a sense of failure that, oh, I haven't been able to meditate properly. I can't even do that. And one piece of advice I remember very strongly is that if for people with depression, it can often be a very bad idea to start meditating while you're very depressed if you haven't already built up a practice of doing it before. So it can be more preventative rather than curative. I think that's really important. Um, but what can be done? Well, I guess my overall view on how, as a neuroscientist, it's possible to contribute to addressing some of these challenges is precisely that a lot of mental health issues and psychiatric conditions, if we broaden it out a bit more, well, they're really characterized by differences in conscious experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're to some extent they're characterized by different kinds of behavior. People do different things, but really what matters is what their experience is like. Depression is fundamentally a different experience of the self, of emotion, and of the nature of the self. Um, Other things might involve hallucinations and so on, which are also changes in conscious experience. So if we understand more about what shapes these conscious experiences, the mechanisms that really give rise to them and shape them, I think those give us a set of tools for, firstly, just for maybe going a bit easy on ourselves, recognizing what's going on, recognizing that there's things that are happening inside our brains and our bodies that are responsible, and that we shouldn't take things naively as they seem. Like a lot of mental health challenges, they give us ways of thinking that we just take as being real. Like I am useless, or the voice in my head is coming from the CIA, or something like that. We reify these
Yeah.
experiences, and so you get into a vicious circle. But if we begin to understand, like, oh, a hallucination might be what happens when the brain's predictions are too strong and overwhelm the sensory data. Just knowing that doesn't make the hallucinations go away, but it might help us. It might help the person change their relationship to the hallucinations. And as a neuroscientist, it gets us one step closer to thinking about how we might diagnose and even treat conditions like this when they are really distressing. Because an important bracket here is that not all forms of altered experience are bad. I mean, we have also this tendency to pathologize, to
Yeah.
medicalize differences in ways of being. And I think this is also really dangerous. Is autism something that should be medicalized, or is it something that is a part of our rich diversity of minds?
Mm.
There's
Yeah.
there's a risk there too. But yeah, understanding the mechanisms of experience it gives us a way to relate to them differently, and it gives us ways of ultimately coming up with potential medical clinical approaches when they are needed, but hopefully only when they are needed and not as a kind of social engineering tool.
Right. I think that's essential. Um, I want to talk about a couple more points before I let you go. I think we have a few more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Um, there's this concept, and I want to talk to you about it from a personal point of view. And yes, there may be people who are completely sold by this idea and some critics of the idea, but there are these concepts of lucid dreaming and astral travel, right? And the reason I bring it up, of course, I don't expect you to defend it or put it down, but just from a personal experience, this ties into consciousness again because the idea of sleep, when a human being sleeps, are we conscious? What are we experiencing? Our senses are switched off. Our brain, I don't know, is it off? Is it on? Is it? But I want you to comment on
Not
that.
all.
But another thing I want you to talk about, I'll just share this quick